So we're going to jump from tennis to table tennis and continue with our ratings themes. Our next speaker is Dr. David Marcus. He received his PhD in probability from just down the road here at MIT. He then worked for 22 years as an applied mathematician at the Analytic Sciences Corporation on projects such as error models for the Trident missile and modeling the plume from the oil fires in Kuwait in 1991. In 1999, while a member of the USA Table Tennis Ratings Committee, he developed an improved rating system, and in 2004 he and a colleague launched Rating Central to make this rating system available to table tennis players everywhere. And so I'll hand it off to Dr. Marcus.
So Rating Central provides accurate, automated, and Bayesian table tennis ratings for leagues, tournaments, and organizations. So I'll give a bit of the history of how we came to do this, then discuss the various components of the system and how the flow through the system, who's using it, what the model and algorithm are, and then how we actually do the event processing and reports. And then I'll discuss how the priors are set for the players and a few confusions and misconceptions. So USA Table Tennis, or USATT, has had a rating system since the 1970s. It has a superficial similarity to the ELO or chess system in terms of the numbers are on the same, roughly the same scale, but the algorithm, the formulas are completely different. It has an ad hoc point update chart, which looks somewhat very simple to the players, but then there are a bunch of adjustment formulas that are more complicated. In particular, all the ratings are treated equally accurate. There's no notion of different ratings having different accuracy. And in the U.S., players of all levels, from champion to 5-year-olds, compete in USATT sanctioned tournaments, and they all get ratings on the same scale. So I was a member of the USATT Ratings Committee in 1997, and I was asked if I could develop a better rating system. Some of the problems that we were experiencing, and which the system actually continues to experience for USATT, was excessive volatility of the ratings, sometimes inaccurate ratings, and sometimes players, because the system would be too volatile, they were afraid that if they played a tournament, they would lose more points than they thought they should, and therefore sometimes would avoid playing tournaments. So by the time I developed the new system in 1999, those board members of the USATT Board of Directors who were supportive of this endeavor had all been replaced, and the new board members would oppose anything the ratings committee suggested, and USATT did not adopt the rating system. In 2004, I and my colleague Sean O'Neill decided to launch Rating Central on our own. It was Sean is 5 times U.S. men's singles champion, and in contact with clubs, he discovered that a lot of clubs would like ratings of their own that were separate from the USATT tournament system. So it was basically Sean's idea that we do this, and I do the math, statistics, and programming. So here are the components of the system. There are 3 components. There are 2 Windows desktop apps that are used for submitting events, which I've called Zermelo and Cantor. Zermelo manages all aspects of running a table tennis tournament in addition to submitting the results to Rating Central or to USATT. Cantor is a much simpler app that its only purpose is submit events to Rating Central, and it doesn't know anything about the format of the tournament. And the second component of the system is the ratings processor app that runs on my PC at home. And the final component is the website at ratingcentral.com, which shows the match results and the ratings and where the players can see how they're doing. So the first step in the system flow is Zermelo or Cantor is used to submit the event to Rating Central, and this is done by them emailing the results using a simple text format to Rating Central mailbox. By the way, when I refer to an event, this is simply any set of matches that are going to be processed together. So it could be a tournament, it could be a league night at a small club or any club, or it could be all league matches perhaps in a state during a week. So then the next step is the ratings processor on my PC at home will retrieve the email. It then parses the submission, processes the event, and then it uploads the new ratings and results to the website, and this typically takes only a few minutes from the time that the event director submits the event. Corrections are handled by the system in a fully automatic way. The event director simply makes the corrections in whichever app he was using, clicks a button, and the event is resubmitted, and then the system reprocesses both that event and all events subsequent in time to that event that would be affected. So if the player's rating changed and they played another event that's already been processed, the system will reprocess all of the events and keep everything in sync. In addition, several event directors can bypass the apps I provide, and they can submit directly into the system. They simply set up their own computer systems to create the event report in the correct text format. In particular, the Austrian Table Tennis Association does this. So currently we have over 8,000 events in the system, over 37,000 players, over 700,000 matches, over 400 clubs, and over 120 event directors. Many clubs in the U.S. submit their leagues or tournaments. Of course, in the U.S., also USATT has a tournament rating system, which costs money, and they also have more recently a separate league system, so they're kind of our competitors. Some directors will submit, depending on the event and what they're trying to do, to USATT or to Rating Central, or some submit to both. But we do provide official ratings and rankings for several organizations. In particular, the Austrian Table Tennis Association has recently adopted us for all their official ratings and rankings. And there are 2 states in Austria that have been using the system. In particular, the Lower Austrian Table Tennis Association has been using it for several years now. And more recently, the Salzburg Table Tennis Association, another state in Austria. And in another country, starting with the letter A, we're doing really good in countries starting with letter A. In Australia, Table Tennis Queensland has been using the system for quite a long time, even before they were actually using the algorithm even before we launched Rating Central. And in the U.S., the National Collegiate Table Tennis Association uses the system to process all of their events and their official ratings and rankings. They're actually quite active, and they organize quite a lot of events between college teams in the U.S. 3 additional Austrian states, from what I understand, are planning to join the system as soon as they can work out some details of how to submit data and how to set up some of the priors for their events. And one additional Australian state tells me they're thinking of it. In terms of non-official use of the system, I pull off the results from the ITTF International Table Tennis Federation Pro Tour and Junior Circuit events from the ITF website and submit them to the system myself, and some of my colleagues will submit other international tournaments or leagues. So you can go to our website and see rankings of the top players in the world and compare them, if you like, to what the ITTF official rankings are. So the model and algorithm next. It's a Bayesian model. So each player has a playing strength, which is a number that quantifies how strong the player is. Then the next piece of the model is the probability of upset function, which I've graphed here. And this gives the probability that the weaker player will win the match as a function of the difference in their playing strengths. So as you see from the graph, if the difference in playing strength is 0, then of course the probability of each player winning is 1/2. As you get out to a difference in playing strength of about 100, then the probability the weaker player wins drops to about 0.2. And at a difference in playing strength of 200, the probability is now quite down to about 0.05, so it's quite unlikely that the weaker player will win. So the player's playing strength is not known, so we model that as a random variable, which I'll call the player's law. And we use a normal prior, and I'll discuss a little later how we set the means and standard deviations. And the final component of the model is the temporal update, and this models how a player's playing strength changes in time. And what we do is the temporal update adds a 0 mean, normal, random walk to the player's law with a standard deviation of 70 rating points per year. In other words, if we knew the player's playing strength exactly now, in 1 year their law would have a standard deviation of 70 rating points. So that's the model, but how do we actually calculate numbers out of it? If we just try to write down the formulas, we see they aren't really tractable. So if we suppose we have a tournament, and then we want to write down what the posterior probability is of what a player's playing strength is. First, we have to take the product of all the priors or the player's laws at the beginning of the event. So that's the product of the L's here, where each L is the prior or the player's law at the beginning of the event. Then we have to multiply that by the likelihood of the match results in that tournament. So that's the probability of upset function pi with the argument being the difference in the playing strengths of the two players in that match, and then you multiply that one of those factors for each of the matches in the tournament. So if we have that's the product in the middle there, and then to get the posterior law for one of the players, we're going to have to integrate out all the variables except the player we're interested in. So, but a tournament might have up to several thousand players, or 1,000 players, or 3,000 matches, so we can't do this integral directly. So to come up with an algorithm that is tractable, I do what I call tournament surgery. And so consider the graph where each player in a tournament or event is a node, and each match is an edge connecting two players. So I've shown a sample graph for a tournament on the left here, and then we're going to apply tournament surgery as I describe on the following slides, and we'll change this graph to the modified graph on the right. Note that I've labeled some of the edges, but not all of them, but each edge that you see represents a match between the players in the circles that the edge connects. So the first step in the tournament surgery is we simply discard any edges that extend down below the second level. So in the example here, we simply discard match M5 and player Q5. And we also discard any matches between players at the second level. So in this example, we discard the green match M4. So then the next step is I want to simplify what happens if I have two players at the first level both playing the same player at the second level. And so what I do here is I introduce another player which I call a twin. So I take player Q4 and I introduce a twin of Q4, which is another separate player but who has the same initial law as the first player. And then instead of having both Q1 and Q2 play Q4, it changes so Q1 plays Q4 and Q2 plays the twin of Q4, Q4 prime. And then the final step, I deal with any pairs of players at the first level who are playing each other, and I again do this by introducing twins. So here we have Q1 playing Q2, and so instead of having them play each other, I introduce twins of each one. So now we have Q1 playing Q2 prime, Q2's twin, and Q2 plays Q1 prime. And so this gives us a nice tree instead of the complicated graph we had before, and this allows us to actually do the integrals and calculate the posterior law. So here's a slightly simplified graph just to show what happens to the formulas. So suppose that we have just the players we see in the top graph here, and we'll assume each player beats the ones immediately below them. Then if we write down the formula for the posterior for player P, it's the integral we see here, but now because of this tree structure of the graph, the integral becomes an iterated integral where I can integrate out one variable at a time, and this is actually straightforward to calculate. There's some intuition that goes along with this algorithm. If I go to a tournament and I play somebody, I'm usually interested in how good they are, especially if I just lost to them. And so I can go look up what their rating was at the beginning of the tournament, because this is usually posted as a list of all the players in the tournaments and their initial ratings. But their initial rating may be out of date, or they may be playing better or worse than that. So I'd like to have a little more information about how they're actually playing now. So I can go to the posted draw sheets in the tournament and look to see how they're doing in the other events they've played and how they've done against other players. And these are exactly the same matches that the rating system looks at. So now the event processing, this is exactly corresponds to the formulas I've just shown. This is just the steps you need to go through to implement those formulas. So the first step that the system goes through is it assigns a law to each unrated player. It then, for each player that already has a rating, it goes into the database and retrieves that player's law and applies a temporal update to bring it up to the present time. And then for each player, in order to calculate their final law at the end of the tournament, the first thing it does is it calculates for each of that player's opponents an adjusted law, and then it updates the player's law for each of the player's matches using for the opponent the adjusted law. And what the adjusted law is it's the opponent's law updated for all of their matches except the ones with the player we're currently doing. So what it is if you remember the tree, it's what you get for each opponent if you process the matches below them in the tree. And then once you get that, then you can go up to the top level and process that match for the player you're interested in. Something to note is that the same opponent will have different adjusted laws when different players are being processed. So here's a numerical example. We suppose that the tournament looks like the graph here at the top, and we're interested in calculating what P's posterior laws, and we'll assume that all players have ratings of 1800 plus or minus 100, where I mean by the plus or minus that 100 is the standard deviation. And we'll assume that each player beats the player below them in the tree. So the first match that we would process is Q1 beating Q4, and this would then result in Q1's updated rating be going from 1800 plus or minus 100 to 1844 plus or minus 90. We then process the match where Q1 beats Q3, and this then updates Q1's rating, so it now changes to 1873 plus or minus 83, and this is what I've been referring to as the adjusted rating for P. We can next process the match where P beats Q1, and this results in P's updated rating being 1862 plus or minus 88, and then finally we can process the match where P beats Q2, and this gives P's final rating as 1888 plus or minus 82. And if you wanted to calculate the ratings for the other players in this graph, note that you first would have to do the tournament surgery. So for example, if you wanted to get the to figure out Q2's final rating, you would have to delete players Q3 and Q4 because they're more than 2 levels away from Q2 in the graph. A few notes on implementation. Actually, the calculations are done by replacing the continuous laws with discrete laws on the set with points, nodes every 10 rating points. So we just use the points 0, 10 up to 3500. And because the integrands are functions of the difference in playing strength, it turns out that they're actually convolutions, and they can be quite rapidly calculated using the FFT. So now I'll show what the reports that the system generates and which are presented on the website so the players can see. And there are 2 reports for each event. There's a summary report and a detailed report. Here's a sample of the summary report. It simply lists all of the players who are in the event and their initial rating and final rating along with their standard deviations. And then the point change is simply the change in the mean of the player's law from initial to final. Here's what beginning of what a detailed report looks like. So we list the player's name at the top. So here's player Claude Boulard, and in the top right it summarizes his results for the tournament. So he started the tournament at 1701 plus or minus 53, and he ended up at the end of the tournament with a rating of 1791 plus or minus 41. And the matches that he won are listed on the left, and his losses are on the right. And next to each player we have the opponent's rating, which is the adjusted rating for that player. I'll note a couple things here. First off, the asterisk. A player may play another player more than once. The system calculates, processes that match, those several matches between the same 2 players as a unit. It simply is doing that integral, and you can't split out the integral because the integrand is just the probability of upset function raised to the number of matches depending on the wins and losses. So what is displayed by the system in the report, so for example here Claude Boulard beat Alex Landsman twice, and it shows plus 12 for each match, but all the system really calculated was a 24-point total change for the 2 players. As I go to the next slide, note here that Claude won a total of 24 points from Alex for his 2 wins, and if we continue to look at the rest of the detailed report, we can see that Alex, however, lost 42 points total for his 2 losses to Claude. So that's another thing to notice about the system is that the points you win almost never equal the number of points that your opponent lost. Also, we can see here that for the adjusted ratings, notice that Alex lost to Claude, and when Alex's loss to Claude was processed, Claude is shown as 1761 plus or minus 43, and Slavomir Marsak also lost to Claude, but when that loss was processed, Claude's rating is 1771 plus or minus 42. So the adjusted ratings for the opponents will be different when processing different players. This says what I just said, but there's one more interesting feature of the detailed report is that the point change per match is not actually well defined because it depends on the order that the matches are processed, or the order that we do those iterated integrals, and we can do them in a different order. However, regardless of what order we do them in, the total point change for the player for processing all the matches will always be the same. And this is just a general property of calculating a posterior or conditional probability in stages, or of doing an iterated integral. Just Fubini's theorem. And this also makes intuitive sense. I mean, suppose we see a 1900 player beat a 2100 player, then we'll significantly increase our estimate of how good the 1900 player is. And then suppose we see the same player beat another 2100 player, we'll again increase our estimate of how good the player is, but we won't increase it by as much as the first time because we've already moved them up, and now we think they're better. And the fact that the processing order affects the number of points the players can gain per match sometimes confuses the players, but they usually accept the explanation once we explain it to them. Just briefly, a couple of features on the website. Actually, on the website, the reports are copiously hyperlinked. All the names of the players are hyperlinked, so you can jump from the player's name in the summary list to their specific results in the detailed report, and then to their opponent's results, and then to a complete history of the opponent's events. And there's also multiple ways of searching for players, events, and clubs by all different attributes, including name and ID and rating and organization and when they played. And player ratings lists may be sorted by name or rating, so you can show a ranking list. And another feature is that you can actually show for a list of players, you can the system will produce what their ratings are at any point in time you specify. So if you'd like to see what the ratings were at the end of last year for your club or for a country, the system can pull that out of the database. Also on the website you can show a graph of any player's player history, and this shows as for each event what their rating was at the end of that event, and you can click on a dot and go to the results in that tournament. So now I'll discuss where the priors come from. As I mentioned, the priors are normal, but we need means and standard deviations for the players, and we get these from the event directors. And there are two types of priors that they can specify, which I call event priors and player priors. The event directors must set the event prior, and they may also set a prior for individual players, but are not required to. So when I say setting a prior, this means they specify a mean and standard deviation. And the way these two priors are used is that if an event prior, if the event director specified a player prior for that particular player, then the system will use that as a prior for that player. If the event director did not specify a prior for that player, then the system will use the event prior. And now I'll give some examples, including some of the instructions that we give to the event directors. This just will be excerpts. The full instructions are on the website. So for the player priors, we tell them that the prior standard deviation measures how sure they are that they know a player's playing strength. So for example, we tell them that if they know an unrated player extremely well because, say, they see them play at their club every week, then they might use a prior standard deviation of 50 to 75 points. And there are more guidelines along those lines. For the event priors, we tell them that it's best to interpret the event prior as describing the range of players that they expect in their event. So for example, if they think that the unrated players at their event will range from 800 to 1400, then we tell them that they should take the average of those two values, which is here 1100, and that should be the mean. And we tell them that we should take the difference in those two values, so 1400 minus 800, that's 600, and divide that by 4 to get 150, and specify that as standard deviation. So we're telling them that the range should be plus or minus 2 standard deviations. Initially, when we first started doing this, I tried to tell them that they should take the range as 3 standard deviations. So that would mean that if they thought the range was 800 to 1400, they would take that difference of 600 and divide by 6 to get a standard deviation of 100. And this always was producing standard deviations that were too small. People just can't imagine 3 sigma events. So in Lower Austria, which is one of the states in Austria, they've been submitting their leagues to the system for many years. Table tennis is very popular in Austria. At the moment, Lower Austria has 1,822 players playing on 4 and 14 teams in leagues organized by playing level or division and region. They also have many other tournaments and additional leagues organized by age. A team plays 16 to 22 times a year and fields 3 to 4 players for each team match. And when a team plays, each player plays 2 to 4 matches, which, by the way, is a little different than most U.S. tournaments, where, because we're a much smaller sport in the U.S., tournaments usually set up so that players will play many more matches than that at a single event. So how is Lower Austria setting the priors? Well, they use a prior for each league division in each region. So that's 40 combinations of division and region. They also have separate priors that they use for juniors, but which are also by age and gender. And they set the priors each year for the main leagues by looking at statistics of the players who have been playing in that league. So they are not using individual player priors. They're simply doing it by generally each event, except for the juniors, where they'll specify a prior for those. There have been a few confusions and misconceptions over the years. Back in 1999, when I just developed the system and was still hoping USATT adopt it, we decided to post on the web all the tournament results in the U.S. for 5.5 years. The idea was that we would show people the results of processing all those tournaments both with the USATT system and with the new system, so they could compare them and see how the two systems compared and how the new one worked. Generally, if a player's rating in the new system was higher than in the USATT system, they liked the new system very much, and if it was lower, they did not like it hardly at all. After a while, we really got tired of illogical complaints, and we decided to simply raise all the ratings in the new system by 100 points. This actually significantly decreased the number of complaints quite a bit. But of course, for most purposes, the ratings are relative, so this really had no influence on how good the two systems were, but really helped with the complaints. Sometimes people think the standard deviation measures how consistent a player is. It doesn't. There's nothing in this model that measures the consistency. It's simply the standard deviation of the player's law, which is the system's subjective belief of how good the player is. It seems that people aren't familiar with using probability to model uncertainty, so they think it has to be describing something that's actually changing in the player. Back when we were trying to get USATT to adopt the system, several opponents often argued that players wanted a system where they could check the rating calculations themselves. They wanted something where the formulas were very simple and that this was the most important thing. As an aside, I'll note that actually the USAT system, while it does have a simple looking rating chart, there are a whole bunch of rather complicated adjustment formulas and formulas for handling unrated players, which almost no one can remember, and absolutely no one who thinks they can calculate their rating knows. So it really isn't actually possible for players to calculate the ratings like they think they do, but many of them believe they can. We felt that the system actually working well and giving numbers that made sense was more important, and that most players would like that. Once we actually got the system out there and people started using it, I don't think I've had anyone complain that they can't check the calculations themselves and so they don't like the system. I think the reason for this is that the system produces ratings that agree with how good the players think they should be rated based on their results, so the numbers seem right, and also so they don't feel the need to check the values. And also we post the results very quickly. As I said, it only takes a few minutes from when a director submits the event, which is often the night of the event or the next day. And so players get that immediate feedback. With the USA system, especially in the older days, it could take a week or several weeks until ratings were posted. And so people wanted to figure out for themselves how they had done. There's more information in my article that appeared in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society, Series E of Statistician in 2001, and a copy of that is on the Rating Central website. And of course, the Rating Central website also has information on Rating Central and the algorithm. Thank you.
So we'll take one question while we're switching out. Yep.
Well, Not exactly. I mean, the mean doesn't change, and the variance, you simply, the variance increases linearly, so the standard deviation is increasing like a square root. It's just 70 squared points per year. It's just a normal random walk, so it's 70 squared points per year, so 70 squared divided by 365 points squared per day that gets added to their variance. Does that answer your question? Yeah.